So my name is Panikos Georgallis. I'm an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam, and I work at the intersection of strategy, organization theory, and sustainability. So my main research interests are around the evolution of moral markets or sustainable markets. I've also looked at the interaction between civil society and business, mostly social movements, but more broadly, civil society, as well as the interaction between policy and firms. It's an interesting question because I think a lot of it goes back to my very early years of the PhD and even before. So when I started my PhD, I didn't really have a background in management or organization theory. I had a background in engineering, and for my master's, I did some work for a European-funded project on renewable energy markets and renewable energy policy. So when I started my PhD, I didn't know what I want to do in terms of the domain, but I really wanted to study that industry. I wanted to study renewable energy. And I was lucky in the sense that around the time that I was starting, there were a few papers that came out at the intersection of social movements and markets that were quite influential for my thinking. So one especially was looking at the, by Westsine and Brandon Lee. It was published in ASQ in 2009. And it was looking at the impact of the environmental movement on the wind energy industry. And when I read that paper and a few other papers in that domain, I had this kind of aha moment that I didn't know what I wanted to do, but now I know, and this is it, right? And of course, somebody had done it, so I had to do something different. But that's what got me interested in research on social movements and markets. And I think my interest in sustainability was kind of a natural consequence also of the settings that I was looking at. I was looking at the solar energy industry for my PhD. It's also a natural consequence of my interest in social movements because they tend to be involved in markets that have either some unsustainable or sustainable practices. And there was also some path dependency, of course, because once you go to a few conferences on the topics you're interested, you build a community, you learn more about that domain, and that I think is what got me into the field of sustainability in the business area and the management area. So the starting point for that paper is the idea that market formation is a very complex process, right? It relies on contributions by multiple actors, so it's very rare that one actor, so one company or one NGO or whatever, will be able to build a market, right? And as long as these different actors, private enterprises, either existing firms or entrepreneurs, social movement organizations that might be involved in building moral markets or markets that address grand challenges. Governments as well tend to be involved. So as long as they contribute something that might be substitutable, it's possible that there are different paths to market formation, right? So, and that's the main idea of the paper, is that market formation is an equifinal phenomenon in that there are different ways to get to market formation, coming out of different combinations of the actors and conditions in a given place. And for that, we're kind of looking at, we have a comparative analysis of the solar energy market across countries, and we're trying to see the combination of the actors that are in place and the opportunity structure that they face, how those different combinations lead to market formation or not. I think it's a very interesting question because the notion of balance implies that there is a trade-off between these activities, right? And there's, I don't want to ignore the fact that there is a trade-off in terms of time, the time that you put in developing writing for a practitioner journal, or writing a blog for a wider audience versus the time that you're putting in for an academic article, right? So there is certainly a trade-off there, but as activities themselves, I think they're actually quite synergistic. For me, theorizing and writing good theory, it requires observation, right, of what is happening in the real world, right, and understanding a phenomenon very deeply. And by understanding a phenomenon very deeply, you're better able to identify causal mechanisms, which is really at the heart of theorizing. And on the flip side, the process of abstraction, which is also a key process of theorizing, allows you to understand where your findings may apply and to identify who is the right audience for those findings. Who are the managers or the policymakers that are going to benefit from the findings from your study. So in many ways, I think they're actually synergistic. Yeah, so that's also a very good question. I think that surely if you ask 100 different people, they will give you 100 different answers, right? So this is very much subjective, what I feel is interesting. But I'll maybe mention two areas that I think could be explored further. So one has to do with the emergence and development of moral markets, right? So these markets that have like a normative component, that are perceived as better than alternatives because of their social or environmental benefits. And there has been a lot of work in this area in the last few years, taking a social movement perspective or a perspective of institutional entrepreneurship, institutional work, market categories. So it's a very vibrant area of research. But what I see is that most of the time, researchers, and myself included, we tend to focus on one particular market, right? So we go deeply into an industry and we try to understand what's happening and how that industry is emerging. And what we don't have enough of is analysis of the inter-industry effects, right? So how does the promotion of the plant-based meat market affect the market for lab-grown meat? How does the promotion of solar energy affect the market for wind energy? Or even between markets that are more versus less sustainable, right? So we don't have a lot of information on these inter-industry effects. And of course, there is a reason for that. It's really hard to study two industries deeply. It's already hard enough to do it for one. But that's certainly an area where I would want to see more work being done. The second area that I wanted to highlight, and again, it comes from my own personal research interests as well, but that has to do with firm responses to climate change. And again, we have a lot of research on firm responses to climate change, but I would say that most of that research looks at indirect effects, right? So indirect pressures from regulators, from consumers who are trying to push companies to be more sustainable, from activists, from shareholders, and so on. We know less about the direct physical impacts of climate change, right? While there is some work that's growing right now, I think we don't have enough theorization around these questions, understanding how do firms respond to things like climate disasters or more slow changes due to climate change. Why do these firms respond differently, and so on. So that's another area that I would want to highlight. There are some things that are relatively trivial and maybe obvious, but maybe still worth mentioning, that it's important to know your audience, right? And sometimes we forget that. We have to be really well aware of course, for every single paper, who is the intended audience? Who are the people who are going to be reading it? What's the conversation that we're adding to? And I always try to think of actually specific people that could get this paper and think, okay, would they agree that what I'm identifying as a gap is actually a gap? Would they agree that this would be a contribution to the literature? And this applies also to journals, right? So if you go for a wide range of journals, it's important to read those journals, especially read recent papers, recent developments, to understand where people are coming from in that community, and to be able to tailor your message in a way that is appealing to that specific audience. And of course, it can also help if you're not as familiar as you would want to be with that journal. You can also, of course, work with others, right? So I have a couple of papers in international business journals. I don't consider myself an IB author, an IB scholar, but I worked with papers who are experts in international business and who could bring value from that perspective, and I could bring value from a more strategy or organization theory lens. So sometimes just collaborating with others is a way to write for more varied range of journals. I would say that it's important to have expertise, right? If we look at research I have studied, among other things, I've studied identity and categories. And what we know from that research is that if it's easier for people to categorize you, if you have a focused identity, then you get more favorable evaluations, right? That applies for organizations, it applies for markets, it applies for people as well. And I think you might hear that, especially those going on the job market, that you have to have like a very focused identity. And I think there is some truth to that, and that's what research tells us. At the same time, I think it's important to combine this identity, which usually relies on some expertise that you have, to combine it with more general knowledge, right? So that you can talk to people about their own projects that might be in a very different area of research, that you can contribute to seminar series, that you can work with co-authors on different projects. So I would say it's nice to combine a focused identity with kind of more general knowledge. But having said that, I would still argue that what's more important is that whatever you're doing to be comfortable, that you can do it well, right? And to do it well, you have to develop some expertise, of course, and you can't develop expertise on 17 different things, right? But if you can do 2 things well, or 3 things well, or 4, yeah, I don't know, who cares about identity, right? So a lot of us are in academia because we have this autonomy to work on whatever we like, within bounds, as long as we can do it well, right? So if you can do it well, I think it's important to just focus on what you like as well, right? So moderate a little bit this, not over-strategize, and moderate whatever you think outsiders expect with also your preferences. So the first thing I would say is it's about project selection, and selection among multiple projects, which is something that people face not necessarily at the beginning of their PhD, but usually closer to the end or when they're assistant professors. And my advice would be not to over-diversify too much. And I don't mean that in the perspective of doing things on different topics. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to develop expertise, and because you cannot develop expertise on too many different things, that works itself out, right? So you will have some sort of focus in terms of the different projects that you have. But what I mean is don't over-diversify in terms of the sheer number of projects. So what we know from, if we look at research on happiness and job satisfaction, we know that knowledge workers tend to be more satisfied with their work when they can focus on a challenging task, right? When they can immerse themselves on a specific task. And I think if you spread yourself too thin, if you have like too many projects and you don't have enough time to work on any of them, you probably lose that satisfaction that comes with doing high quality work, right? So it's harder to reach the same level of quality when you have too many projects, and you also lose the satisfaction that comes with it. And I personally, the papers that I'm most proud of are also the papers that I spend the most time on. So that would be my first piece of advice. So my second piece of advice has to do with how to deal with these very long timescales that we have in academia, which are quite unique. So you have projects that can take anywhere from a couple of years to 10 years, right? And the outcome of your efforts is quite disconnected in terms of the temporal timescale from the day-to-day work. And on the macro side, what I would say is that try to take your time. Take your time to develop yourself as a researcher, and that can be getting to know research methods more deeply. It could be about going more deeply into specific theories. It could be about going more deeply into the context that you're studying. Don't rush it, and don't try to find shortcuts. If there are shortcuts, I don't know them. I think it's really important to put in the time and develop yourself as a researcher. And of course, that's easier said than done, right? On the practical side, usually when you're in a PhD program, it's usually 4 or 5 years, right? And the funding ends at some point. But it's important to think about what the PhD is for, right? So one point of the PhD is, yes, you get your dissertation finalized, but the other point is that it has to prepare you for a career as a researcher, if that's what you want to do, if you want to stay in academia. And most people who finish their PhD, they do it around their early 30s, right? Which means you have like 35, maybe more years of a career. So it's sometimes worth it to take a little bit more time. So if you have the opportunity to if you feel like you're not ready and you have the opportunity to extend your PhD or to find a postdoc or try to find a job that allows you to keep developing as a researcher, I would recommend that. The second part of this is, so this was more about the macro side, right? So on the micro side, on the day-to-day work, okay, so how do you deal with your work on a day-to-day basis when the outcomes will be seen, 3, 4, 5 years down the road? Of course, the outcomes are important, a dissertation, a publication, and so on, but you can't wake up every day and go to the office and say, today, my goal is to write a dissertation, or today my goal is to write a paper for AMJ, right? You need to break your work into meaningful tasks, right? Try to have, my advice would be to try to have like one main thing that you're going to do for the day, and then focus on what's in front of you, right? This paragraph that you have to write, this piece of analysis, or this interview that you need to interpret. And they say that it's not the destination that counts, it's the journey, right? So if you don't focus too much on the destination, maybe you'll also enjoy the journey and enjoy the day-to-day work of doing research. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.